further ado, here's Professor Majfud.
Okay, let's start. The first time I visited the United States in 1995, I had to fill out a form before arriving. In the race section, I wrote no race. It was the first time in my life that I had read such a classification. A decade later, after traveling and living in some 50 countries, I returned to set up in a classroom here, actually in UGA. Over time, I understood that you had to play the game, the more Hispanic, Hispanic instead of white, the more political power the government affords them. The logic is well traveled. Minority groups accept being confined to a box with a label conferred by the dominant group. Through sharing a language, a history, and an otherness, and whether I wanted to or not, at 40 years of age, I began converting myself into a Hispanic, among other things. Like any social group, we are an invention, a political and symbolic construction. In fact, the terms Hispanic and Latino are inventions of the United States government, or precisely they use to tag a specific group. In fact, this is nothing new, especially considering the country's obsession with race since before it was founded. As an invention, as an invention, we Hispanics are a reality, and as a reality, many wish to escape from the box, not in rebellion, but rather in submission. A Z that needs to be accepted by the A group must be at least 200% A to be accepted as an almost A. In a civilized society, change is allowed, but no one needs to forget who they were, or who they are, or who they want to be integrated or accepted, leaving aside the neo-slavery and neo-imperialistic doctrine of assimilation. Furthermore, the idea of being accepted is another invented need. Why the hell do I care if others do not accept me as I am? When someone in a supermarket sees red because of another speaks to their language or speak the child or the cashier in Spanish, they create their own laws about the language that must be spoken in this country. This person is breaking the same laws they claim to defend. Everything that is not prescribed by the law is permissible. As history shows, no progression towards equal rights originated from the groups in power. I don't know any example, except at the end when the society achieves certain consensus, politicians begin to champion about the new values in society. As we can name many examples about that. Instead, they came from organized resistance of those below. In this sense, we Hispanics in the United States have a historical debt. Yes, we had a Cesar Chavez, but we have been far too accommodating in the face of an obscene list of injustices. We have not had a Malcolm X who dared to speak directly to power radically rather than delicately. Even worse, countless times we have betrayed the heroic struggles of other minorities. Firstly, because privileged immigrants have been unable to resist the temptation to pass off as white. Secondly, because we, Latin Americans, have also been corrupted by centuries of interventions and dictatorship promoted by Washington. Of course, in that case, around 2 centuries. And the corporation, that was crucial. We need to understand this. If we don't understand this, we don't understand our present and nothing in history. Corporation that installed and removed puppets as presidents or dictators. No one calls extremely impoverished countries such as Haiti and Honduras, just to name two, capitalist, even though they are more capitalist than the US. Thus, the greatest expulsion of immigrants, usually black or mestizo and poor, come from these capitalist countries that are not on Washington's boycott list. The immigrants who depends on their work to survive, and very frequently escaping from those bloody dictatorships, right-wing bloody dictatorship to protect foreign investors and investment and business. Poor people must adhere to the law of supply and demand in an even more dramatic fashion than capital. But capital is free. The workers are not. They are not even free to say what they think. The very same immigration laws, everyone who has been in a US embassy for a visa will be aware of this, detest workers, hate workers. Never say that you love to work in the US embassy, never. You have to say you are a very lazy person, but you have money in your bank. That is the best. So, when a Z Hispanic arrives in a country with this hegemonic force, often fleeing from the violence, corruption, and chaos organized by the same country, they dress up as an Hispanic. Many claim to be fleeing from countries where they do not have freedom of expression, but the second they hear a different opinion, they vomit the old myth from the A group. If you do not agree, go to another country. That's very similar to the very fascist motto from the Brazilian dictatorship, by the way, installed by and supported by Washington in 1964. And the motto was Brasil, ame ou deixe-o. In Portuguese, love it or leave it. And then you may have read in the US the saying, love it or leave it. What does it mean? If you don't agree with our in power, you are against us. You are anti-us. You are a dangerous person. So you don't love our country because you disagree. So it is as if the adulation of power and the reification of national myth were a moral and constitutional obligation, as if countries had honors, as if they were cults, armies, football teams, political parties, as if critical thinking and the search for truth were somehow anti-American. In 2019, a terrorist killed 23 Hispanic people in a Walmart in Texas. Everybody remember, that's going to be forgotten, obviously, as many other terrible domestic terrorist attacks that are many, as paramilitarism is very popular here in the US, not just in Colombia. The Colombian paramilitarism responsible for 90% of the deaths throughout 40 years in Colombia were an invention of Washington. They explicitly said that's their way to not just to organize and control dissidents, but also to prevent someone blaming us. So channel money to those paramilitary, and the same happened in Brazil, the death squads, etc. All those were not by coincidence in the same ideological group that supported big companies, big money, big capitals, and were against common people, middle class, workers, etc. Actually, the word worker became a taboo. Here we have a Labor Day, we don't have Workers' Day. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world celebrates May the 1st to remember the tragedy in Chicago, a very strong workers' organization in Chicago, and a way to forget that too dangerous. Poor people are always dangerous, mostly when they are organized. Remember, the racism was inoculated also before the foundation of this country in order to divide poor white people who were, some of them were indentured slaves, also black people who were always slaves, and Indians. So the way to corrupt them and divide was to inoculate racism, and that was explicitly written in, for example, in Governor Chamberlain, North Carolina. In 2019, a terrorist killed 23 Hispanic people in Walmart in Texas, alleging that the Hispanics were invading his country. his country. And also remember, those like Minutemen and many other groups that war, that's WAR, White Aryan Resistance, and many others, were founded and are integrated by people who were acting in many other countries. And for example, in the Nicaragua, they trained the Contras, the CIA trained them, but there were many of those elements who trained them. So it's okay, the borders to defend are our borders, but other people's border doesn't matter, it's our frontier. So we have the right to explore, as it was said in the 19th century. But their borders doesn't exist. The only border that we have to defend, because this is a country of law. Another myth, because every single treaties with the Indians, with Mexicans, with any other people were broken by Washington. So it's not a country of law. And Stephen Austin lobbied Mexico since 1822 to 1836. All those were Mexican, became Mexican citizens. But during the 30s, Mexicans realized that that was very dangerous because the new immigrants never observed any law. Not even the most important law for that was the center of the conflict, that was not to have a slave in Mexican territory. And Austin and Houston lobbied in the Mexican capital, in the Mexican Congress, to make Texas an exception. It was not all Texas as we know it today. They owned just the strait in the Gulf. They were very fertile land, and they made a lot of money with cotton. But they need other people to work for them and to make them, that is, black people, slave people. And that was the reason why Texas became independent. And then you had in the high schools, we need to establish more freedoms in Texas. That is why we made Texas independent. Come on, your freedom, because you reinstalled and put in the Constitution. Now slavery cannot be even questioned. So the reason is too obvious. Every letter you can read at that moment, even Austin said, the only Mexicans are great, I will never betray them, but the only problem is that they insist that the slavery had to be illegal, they don't accept slavery. And if not for that, we would be all happy. But it's just a little. And then you have, for example, the Alamo, a very mythical movie by a white supremacist, John Wayne, produced and backed by white supremacists. Well, he was in People's Magazine, 1972. He said, well, I don't agree with, and remember the Marlon Brando, when he didn't accept the Oscar and sent a representative of the Indians. But besides that, he said, I don't agree saying that we have to apologize for anything. We did the right thing. Indians had too much land and they didn't want to share with us their land, so we have to protect it. And if you take a car and drive from Georgia to Georgia to North Carolina, anytime, any state, you can drive and drive and drive, even with modern technology, the best highways, hours and hours, and you are not going to see anything. So that was too little land for them. So they need more. Remember, they need many weeks to go from one state to the other state. So it was not that they need land, even if they didn't need land, that was not the other people's problem. It was an obsession, probably a cultural psychological problem, to take and feel that they have everything under control, particularly the imperial races. And that has been repeated in the Congress many times. But I can interrupt my reading for a while, but I would like to I think I have a few quotes here. Let me see. For example, well, General Wilford Scott, obviously, he hated Paul because he was trying to invent an excuse to provoke the Mexicans. And and then to say we were attacked first, and then we have to go to the war, and that's what he did. And actually, the limits of when Mexico recognized that they lost Texas, they have the limit that there was the Sabine River. In every document was the Sabine River. Everything was very clear. And Paul said, sent an emissary, said, go and look for another river with the same name. If you don't find it, name it with the Sabine River. So if the reality doesn't adapt to our words, sorry for the reality. So, General Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican-American Revolution, and General Zachary, the president, Zachary Taylor, thank you, who was a president in the 50s. And even Ulysses Grant, who wrote a letter to Julia, and all those documents are very consistent. And for example, that from General Winfield Scott, our militia volunteer, if a tenth of what is said be true, have committed atrocity horrors in Mexico, sufficient to make heaven with and every American of Christian morals blush for the country. Murder, robbery, rape on mothers and daughters in the presence of the tied-up males of the families have been common all along the Rio Grande. So the US was not sending the best people, obviously. The same senator, but a few years later, we have never dreamed to incorporating into the Union any but the Caucasian race for the free white race. That's the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico will be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. Or Sullivan, the creator of the Manifest Destiny. This continent is for the white people, and not only the continent, but the island adjacent and the people must be kept in slavery at Cuba and Haiti under white Republican masters. As for the free black, there is another continent for them. The Mongol doctrine is not sufficient. Of course, they sent them to Haiti and to Africa. They founded Liberia City because of them. I actually have a student from Liberia, etc. 1858, it was Albert Brown was governor of Massachusetts and senator at this moment, and said, I want Cuba. I know that sooner or later we must have it. If the worm-eaten throne of Spain is willing to give it for a fair equivalent, money was a way to legitimize every time. We can see that, but we are not going to have time, I think. Well, if not, we must take it. I want Tamaulipas, Potosí, and one or two other Mexican states. And I want them all for the same reason. For the planting and spreading of slavery. Yes, I want these countries for the spread of slavery. I will spread the blessing of slavery, like the religion of our divine master, to the uttermost ends of the earth. They, of course, imposed that, and even recently, using very violent means. If that democracy worked, okay. If they voted, as Nixon said when Dr. Allende won the election in 1970, Nixon said, I'm not going to tolerate that the people vote the wrong guy in the irresponsible way. Of course, in 1958, Allende lost the election to Alexander, a conservative president, and then lost the election again in 1964 with Eduardo Frei. But in both elections, the CIA put $1 million in the campaign. And in the 1970s, money was not enough, and so Henry Kissinger and Helms and many others said, well, let's prepare another coup. And before Allende took office, the documents are there. September 1970 through September 11, the tragic day for Chile, September 11, 1973. It was a bloody dictatorship, a Nazi-like dictatorship with thousands of people massacred, torture, etc. And we can talk a lot about the successful neoliberal agenda that was imposed on Chile before being imposed to the US here. I need 10 hours to complete this, but I'm going to move faster. Remember, Nazism was an inspiration of many intellectuals, racist and intellectual in the tradition of the US. Hitler recognized, for example, the book The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916. And Hitler was in jail, was a soldier at that moment, wrote that book read a book, wrote my count, and took many sentences and ideas from that book, and actually sent a letter to Madison Grant in New York saying, "Thank you for that book, that's my Bible." Say that, and but that was, if you want to trace the Nazism tradition in the KKK and many other very American groups, that is very easy, and not by chance the big billionaires in the US were all most of them were pro-Nazi, and they were integrated by Hitler, Henry Ford, the GM CEO, Texas CEO, Alcoa, that helped a lot of Hitler, and Walt Hearst, the one with Joseph Pulitzer, who invented the Spanish-American War from out of the blue. They invented the son of the USS Maine in hours when the crew in La Habana said, "We have an accident, a terrible accident here. More than 200 Americans died," and it was an accident. The crew said that it was an accident. But in the New York, they wanted to sell papers. They sold 1 million copies per day. They did a great business. They say not even a crazy guy would believe that Spain attacked us. But they invented that attack, and so we were attacked first. Never forget the name, and that is what people today remember. Ask to a high schooler why the Spanish-American War. Because the Spanish sunk the USS Maine. Because we were attacked first, we had to defend ourselves. So that was to stall, to kidnap a revolution almost ended by the Cuban people. And but what was the problem? Remember that the southern politicians expanded by land Indian territories, then Mexican territories, etc., then Philippines, etc., by the sea. But they stopped in the borders we have today. And the discussion was, why not to take Cuba? Why not to take the rest of Mexico? If we were in the capital, they were completely defeated because of the earthquake, but also because of a terrible war. They didn't want to, as usually Cicerón say, poor Mexican, they don't want to even fight this war. And why we didn't take everything? But we can do that now. And the same racists who made that a reality were the same that established a limit, a border. Why? And if you read the newspaper at that moment, you will understand why. They didn't want another black state. They called any states. Cuba was considered a white country until they invaded Cuba and said, "Oh, but most of the people here are black people. We already have too many problems with remember the Jim Crow era after Lincoln. And so we don't want hybrid people, Mexican. We don't want more. So this is the government of the white race." So, and actually, just keep in mind why, just mention this here very quickly. New Mexico and Arizona was taken in 1848. It didn't become a full state until 1912. Can you guess why? The Hispanic were a majority. And they sent many multiple commissions to check until when they became a minority, a responsible race took place, but became a majority, they became a full state of the US. And the same, and some people say, how would you say that the US was never a dictatorship? Which is a complete matter of interpretation. If you point out a country and say in that country only between 10 and 20% in the best moment can vote, but they have to be honored, they have to be male, they have to be white, and you have 1 million of people enslaved, sometimes in some states a majority, and you call that a democracy. Well, name it whatever name you want it, but it's highly questionable. For me, that's a perfect dictatorship, ethnicity dictatorship. And that practice continues even today, but not because of the law. The law, unfortunately, have changed for the good. This psychology of the colonized, of the individual desperate to accept it through disguising themselves, continue to this day. So consequently, the greatest service that anyone can do for this country is not to go to the beach with the stars and stripes emblazoned across their bathing suit, but rather to tell the truth. Above all, inconvenient truths, those that have been buried by the brute force of barbarism in the name of civilization, and also in the name of dictatorship, in the name of freedom, in the name of democracy. That's very common in Latin America. Until then, we will continue to be complicit in imperial myth, just as we maintain those those useless patches of grass at the front of our houses to avoid rising tables, perfectly geometric and with no sign of human life around them, the neurotic expression of Anglo-Saxon control, even of nature. Someone said in the 19th century that he was referring mostly to Protestant. That was an American writer. The Protestantism, I don't agree with that such generalization, but it's kind of a joke at that moment. Protestantism was the fear that someone somewhere can be happy. We do the same with the myths. The country will never overcome the trauma of the Civil War, nor will achieve great social progress until it stops lying to itself. We Hispanic can contribute to a courageous change, or we can join the ranks of cowardly self-satisfaction and the misty-eyed adulation of power. And finish here so we can take your question. Go on. Yes,
Jorge, I'm shocked to discover that our country has ever invaded another country. Shocked.